France International. The second speaker this evening, we're very lucky to have Professor William Zartman, who served, welcome, who served as the Jacob Blaustein Professor of International Organizations and Conflict Resolutions at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies for nearly 20 years. He is the former director of the SAIS Conflict Management and African Studies programs and has taught at the University of South Carolina, New York University, the U.S. Naval Academy, the Institute of Political Studies in Paris, and the American University in Cairo. He was previously a consultant to the U.S. Department of State, president of the Tangier American Legation Institute for Moroccan Studies, past president of the Middle East Studies Association and the American Institute for Maghreb Studies, member of the International Steering Committee of Processes of International Negotiations program based in Europe. He has received an honorary doctorate from the Catholic University of Louvain, and he completed his PhD in international relations at Yale University. I will spare you an introduction of myself. You can find that at the Georgetown University website. Just will ask Professor Zartman if you have a preference as to how we proceed, whether you would like to be the first speaker, the second, the third speaker. It's completely up to you. Okay. Sure. Okay. Welcome. Thank you very much.
Since I just made it, you can't park in this place. I'm practically parked at SAIS. You walk over. Well, I only asked to talk first. It says Ben Ali in the U.S. on the screen in front of me. I talk first because... no, that's all right. I remember who the president was of Tunisia. So that nobody else will steal my thunder, but maybe we'll all repeat ourselves all the way through. You've all read all about what's going on in Tunisia and blogged it and that kind of stuff, and it's a little hard to know where to start. We had a program last night, and the speaker, it wasn't as bad as all that, but the speaker started with the French protectorate, and I'm going to spare you that because I think you know about it. To my mind, the most striking thing about the revolution that's going on is its spontaneity. It really came out of nowhere. That is to say, it really came out of the Tunisian people. And I think from there on, one can weave a tale that tells a lot about what what's going on now and raises questions and maybe tells a little bit about what will go on. Let me say, first of all, everybody says that it's of all places, Tunisia, one didn't expect it to happen there. And yet, I think if we look back into history, and I've been around long enough so that history is things that I've lived through, it's happened before. And this is the Tunisian way of doing things. At least in two instances, the Tunisians got out in the streets and met security forces. In 1978, when the regime was going through some very difficult times in its internal politics, where Bourguiba was clamping down on the liberal wing and clamping down on the party auxiliaries as well. And in that case, it was the Socialist Destour Party against the UGTT, and people were killed. And the security forces held on, and finally the regime worked its way out of it and held elections soon afterward, which were contested and marked a step, at least a step, it's hard to tell forward or not, but a step at that point in Tunisian politics. More important, I think, or more striking, were the events of 1984. And I think the events of 1984 have some very interesting parallels with what is going on now. One of my heroes, as I look at North Africa, was a guy who walked into the bakery at Douz in southern Tunisia, and found himself confronted with a strong increase in the bread prices, because Tunisia was faced with structural adjustment and things like that, and ran screaming out of the shop and said, "I can't feed my kids the way I'm used to. And I think if you're interested in protest and revolt and things like that, it's a very interesting example of not that he was going to starve, but that his standard of living was going to fall. That is the J curve, or the revolution of falling satisfactions, what he was compared to what he was used to. And the flame spread throughout Tunisia, and it was a time in which people's cars were burned, and where in Tunis the signs of ostentatious wealth were destroyed, because, as many of you know, certainly in North Africa, the houses are supposed to traditionally have a very anonymous facade outside, and whatever riches they have are inside, but not shown on the outside. So this is a Tunisian way of doing things, and in both cases it led to serious changes in the politics, not in the party, not in the type of government, because Bourguiba was there in both cases, and he came out of the clouds and fired his prime minister, and said that the other guys had made the mistake, and they all loved him. This time he didn't come out of the clouds. But at least this time, again, it's in the tradition of what happened in the other times, that it was the people who were rising up, and the revolution took place. I think they ought to call it the Facebook Revolution instead of the Jasmine Revolution, because we've seen lots of things taking place because of mobile phones. But this is one in which the next generation of mobile phones, that is the Facebook phenomenon, was the one that really carried the revolution through the Tunisian people. So it was a popular explosion. And again, there are lots of explanations of why the people exploded. And one of them that's given by governments and given by journalists and so on as well is the economic situation. And yet, unlike that poor guy in Douz, what happened in Sidi Bouzid, what happened in Kasserine, and then what spread into Tunis was not a question of economics or the J curve or the revolution of falling satisfactions. Although economics are getting tougher, it still is a situation where there was a much deeper reason for explosion, and that is what my Arabic is not fluent, but I pick up words here and there, and what is known in Algeria as al-hugra, the arrogance and the disinterestedness of government, a poor governance kind of situation. And this is what we see, by the way, in Algeria, and what we see in Egypt as well as the present time, and I'll come back to that. Economics weakened or really strengthened the reaction, but what people had in their reaction, what the French would call a ras-le-bol, my cup runneth over, was just that they were sick of government that didn't care about them. It's interesting, too, as a Tunisian phenomenon, that it overcame what I just learned recently was called the Fosse Romana. That is, when Scipio destroyed Carthage, he built a ditch down, kind of diagonally down Tunisia. And this was Roman, and the other was barbarian. And it took place on the barbarian side, in the poorer side, the side that was outside of the center of Tunisian politics. A place, Sidi Bouzid, Kasserine, which has been known for explosions before. And it ran from the countryside to the Sahel, to the Beldi families in Tunis itself. So it's not only spontaneous, but it came, and not only just from the people, but it came from the popular side, the rural side, the poorer side of the people. The biggest implication of this is that there's an organizational vacuum. And that's much different from what we're usually used to looking at in revolts, revolutions of this kind. Now, there are lots of candidates, and that, therefore, beginning that way with the spontaneous revolution leads one, I think, to look at what are the candidates and what are the other parties and what's their position in this situation. In many situations of this kind, for example, in Algeria in '88, when the riots took place that finally caused Chadli to open up the political system. The FIS at that time, the Islamists came roaring in and said, "Let us provide the order," and they, in some ways, they were able to do that. So, what about the Islamist forces? Well, there's the traditional, long-standing Islamist party in Tunisia that's banned, the Nahda, or what's I think badly translated as the movement for the Islamic tendency. It should be the movement for the Islamic way, which was weak to begin with. And one of the worst things about Ben Ali was that he acted as if this was a great big threat to him, when in fact it never was a very deep-seated Tunisian move, and whatever was left there of it, or whatever existed of it, he destroyed in the early 90s with vigor and blood. So Ennahda is not likely to provide the order that's necessary. Rashid Ghannouchi is back, or is coming back, I think. And he says he's a moderate Islamist and he wants a democratic system and so on. And he's an interesting guy. There's a very interesting biography that's written by him, by Tamimi. But he's really not, I don't think, a danger to, or a likelihood to provide the order in Tunisia. There's Aqim, the Al-Qaeda of the Islamic Maghreb, that causes damage in Algeria and has been messing around in southern Tunisia as well, but is, again, very much of a foreign type of movement, and one that doesn't have any echo in the protesters or in Tunisia in general. But watch the RCD. The RCD is the worst thing now in Tunisia. Nobody wants it. It's supposed to get out of the government. It should be wiped out, just like the Baathists were supposed to be wiped out of Iraq. The RCD has a past. It has many pasts, in fact, overlapping pasts, and it was the worst guy in town back in 1987 when the constitutional coup took place. It was then under the name of the Socialist Asturian Party. And it was so badly viewed that even the leaders of the RCD refused to take public opinion polls to see what their standing was in the public. There were guys in Ben Ali's entourage who urged them to do so. See what their standing was, because they felt that they were so much in public disfavor. Well, they went on and immediately won some by-elections. And Ben Ali, who wanted to be above the parties in those first couple years of his takeover, found himself taken over by the resurgent members of the re-emerging members of the RCD. The RCD, of course, as in the case of the Baathists in Iraq, there are lots of levels of the RCD. They're the really bad guys at the top, and then there are lots of people who couldn't do anything else except by joining the party. And there are people in between who could do something by joining the party and were part of the corruption. But they're the best, most pervasive organization within Tunisian politics at the present time. And although last night we had a session down at SAIS across the river, the Rock Creek, on Tunisia, and there were some Tunisian students who were there who said, never, we'll get them all out, get rid of the RCD. Watch it, they're there. And they're part of the Tunisian population, and they are the most likely to provide some kind of organization for the events that went on. Of course, they'll do what they did before. They'll rename themselves. They'll scramble for a while. They'll get some new leaders, and they'll be on the scene. I'm not saying they'll take over, but I'm saying watch them. And I'm not saying watch them, they're a bad thing. I'm saying watch them, they're part of Tunisian organized politics. There's the UGTT, which is, after all, the most organized, although not the largest organization, but the most organized. It's the one that called a general strike after these events, and it's the one who also left the government because it felt that the government was not legitimate enough with the RCD members in it for it to participate. UGTT is split by various divisions of leadership and of policy, so it doesn't come in as a single force, but it comes in as I say, probably one of the best organized and strongest forces that might provide some leadership to the movement of events these days. Then there's the government. There is a government there. It's weak and it's divided, and it's not quite sure where it stands or who's in charge, but it is the most important element that is needed. And so the challenge to provide some kind of organization in this vacuum will be to provide a government that can represent the people and can provide some kind of order for elections to take place. Two parties are left in the government: Chebi's little party, which are his friends, the PDP, and the Tajdeed party, the former communist, not anymore, party, which has some echo, but is again in many people's minds delegitimized by the fact that it didn't follow the UGTT out and is still staying in the government. Then there's the army. And the army has proven, as we've often said, to be a unique organization in the Arab world, and a unique military organization in the Arab world, doing what cracks a government and brings in a revolution in case after case in Iran and lots of other places. That is, refusing to fire on its own people. It has been a supporter tacitly, and now General Ammar has announced his support for the revolution, the movement. It is, but by that very token, it is non-political. It offers itself at the service of the civilian authorities, and that's the people at the present time. So it's unlikely to take over, although that doesn't mean that individuals are unlikely to take over, and it's always dangerous to see a general come into power even as a transition, and yet that has happened before in other countries, and that's a possibility. As we talk about the army, however, we omit another force, a force of order in the country, and that's the police. The army is 35,000 strong. The police is 150,000 strong. It's not, the police is very much divided. Sometimes they have sided with tried to bring order and sided with the people in the streets, and sometimes they've been rather harsh. In fact, the army has pushed them away, held them back in trying to, the police, try to put down demonstrations. It's not clear where they're going, but it is clear again that they represent a sizable body of people with organization, and one that will be needed to help fill the vacuum. And we don't usually see the police taking over, but it's not conceivable. It's not inconceivable that it represents an organized force, as politics looks for organized forces. And then another element that is rarely mentioned, and this is Grassroots Order. The interesting thing of what's been going on as far as that keeps showing up as far as one can follow without being there is that they're neighborhood organizations that set up their own order. Neighborhood Watch, neighborhood organizations that keep people from tearing down or tearing into the houses in this block. Really a grassroots type of organization that stems from this anomic mass that's creating the revolution. They're not going to take over, but they represent, they are something that needs to be represented or taken into account in this vacuum of forces that we see taking place. Maybe that the most important thing they'll do is simply keep local order. I don't know, I haven't heard so much about the existence of these things in villages, but what I've heard about is these things taking place within Tunis, within urban centers. So it's not a national force. It's not a force that will get much higher than is likely to get much higher than the level it occupies now. But it's interesting to note that it's there. On one hand we have spontaneity and disorder, and on the other hand we have these pockets of order, potential order, presumptive order. That might provide something for the shape of things until that glorious day when elections take place, and that seems to be what everybody is heading toward. A crackdown of the military or the forces of order, as the French term goes, is probably unlikely unless things get totally anarchic. That is, unless these various forces start battling with each other, or unless the absence of some kind of authority becomes too prolonged. What is needed, finally, is a broad-based caretaker government, not the but it will be a hodgepodge, but not the hodgepodge that we have now. We read in the paper about this. What was the radio commentator or something like that who's in charge of information, and then there are a couple, as I've said, a couple party representatives who are there. It's really kind of a mess, and they have neither organization nor authority to operate. And yet, what one needs is a broad-based type of government that will act as caretaker and bring about elections. The Constitution says 60 days, but I think people are talking more about 6 months before an election would be organized. And we have to remember that there's only one organized party in Tunisia, and I've talked about it already. That's the RCD. The others are phantoms with small followings and great ideas, but they don't represent a viable force at this point. And if they do scramble, they're still up against people who've had a lot of experience in winning elections. That's the RCD. One other idea that's been mentioned on what's likely, what can take place, is what the French call a CNS, Conférence Nationale Souveraine, a national sovereign conference, which those of you who look south of the Sahara may remember took place in the early 90s through some 12 states in Black Africa. It was invented in Benin. It took out Carriacou, and it represented a body, a movement which brought together civil society organizations, which then said to their president, "Look, you've been stealing us, and you're incompetent and not legitimate, and just please sit there on the stage, and we've got sovereignty now, you're not sovereign, and we're going to remake the state." And in a number of states it worked. And in a number of states, second lesson, it didn't work because the guy who was sitting there said, "Yes, that's bad, I've done that." And when we hold elections, however, I'm good at elections. And so they came back, as in Congo-Brazzaville and comes to mind, and a number of other countries as well. So, but this does represent, the CNS does represent an organization of the multiple forces that we see in this vacuum that's present in Tunisia at the present time. And although it hasn't been mentioned by name, the idea of a conference of this kind has been mentioned. The final thing I want to just lay out on the table is what's happening in other places. We're so enthralled with Tunisia that we don't forget the other places, but sometimes the news of what goes on gets hidden. One thing is certain, there are two groups of people in the Arab world who are watching what's going on in Tunisia: the people and the rulers. And they're looking for different kind of lessons. The people, as in any kind of riot, revolutionary situation, are asking themselves, they've got the same grievances that they have in Tunisia. But they're asking themselves, what are the chances, what are the risks that I take by going out into the street? Yesterday in Egypt, I think some of you have seen, people measured that risk and went out into the street. And people have been doing that for a number of days now in Algeria. Not as a national movement yet, not Tunisia as yet, but this has been going on. And then on the other side, the people who are watching it, as I said, are the governments. And the governments say, for the most part, the former Jordanian foreign minister who made this comment, the governments say two things. They say it's economic, and they say everything is pretty stable as it is. We're still in control. And so what we will see as a reaction is goodies, bread and circuses handed out in order to keep people from continuing on the Tunisian path. But as I started, it's not economic. It's a spontaneous revolt against arrogant, insulting governance in this part of the world.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And now we will have Professor Noureddine Jebnoun.
Okay. So first and foremost, I would like to thank you, my colleague and friend, Professor Shehata, for organizing this panel. And I would like also to thank you, Mrs. Darrell, for her logistical support. So the title of my paper is Tunisia's Glorious Revolution and Its Implications. Last December 17th, disturbances erupted in Tunisia after Mohamed Bouazizi, a young unemployed high school graduate who was condemned to sell fruits and vegetables on the street stall for a living, immolated himself in protest after authorities had beaten him and impeded him from exercising his unlicensed activity. His act crystallized and incarnated the Tunisians' feelings of humiliation and lack of justice to which they had been subjected by one of the most brutal Arab authoritarian regimes that thrived on infamous corruption and nepotism. A spontaneous nationwide uprising ensued, resulting in the downfall of President Zine al-Abidine Ben Ali, who was serving his fifth consecutive 5-year term and poised to maintain himself or his family in power eternally. His authoritarian regime was disguised in institutional facade of democracy and mainly concerned by its own survival, rather than enhancing the emergence of a vibrant society engaged in the defense and permanent creation of new liberties that allow societies to renew themselves. During its first decade in power, Tunisia enjoyed a notable economic development, backed by progressive social policies that saw the reinforcement of its middle class, while entertaining fear internally and scaring the West with a horrific Islamic alternative if it failed to back it up, the regime was able to stifle civil society in exchange of a relative economic well-being. However, with the onset of the second millennium, the adverse effects of globalization had started to make themselves felt. The popularization of the fragile middle class ensured, indeed slowing exports were barely offset by output of other sectors. Higher growth levels have been difficult to attain to create sufficient employment opportunities for an already large number of unemployment, as well as the growing number of university graduates. The challenges ahead include privatizing industry, liberalizing the investment code to increase foreign investment, improving government efficiency, reducing the trade deficit, and reducing the socio-economic disparities in the impoverished south and west of the country. A better balance between growth and development remains to be achieved. Still, the main reasons that led to the present unbearable accumulation of dissatisfaction and the destruction of civil society can only be imputed to the corruption and nepotism practiced by Ben Ali's uncultured family under the umbrella of a well-lubricated repressive system. In fact, a mafia-like regime paying scant respect to Tunisians' human rights and dignity was instituted, ultimately contributing to discouraging entrepreneurship and freezing local private investment. The result is attested to, among other things, by unemployment figures, the uneven distribution of wealth, the rise of insecurity and violence, the degradation of education, the pursuit of unethical and immoral practices, the lack of solidarity, political repression, humiliation, and most of all, the absence of sentiment of justice. The latter was with time amplified by the traditional word-of-mouth system as well as the internet, despite all forms of censorship. Indeed, Facebook and Twitter proved critical to breaking the total blackout of information sought by the regime, while the international media coverage was very slow in covering the unfolding events, with the notable exception of Al Jazeera TV network. The immediate consequences of the unprecedented protests may be summarized as follows. First, the failure of a 23-year-old police regime in totally stifling civil society and preventing it from communicating and expressing its craving for social and economic justice in the absence of organized structures. Second, the breakdown of the psychological wall of fear that subdued the people while depriving them from their dignity and basic freedoms. Third, finally, the unsustainability of economic and social development in a centrality controlled one-man state solely preoccupied in promoting the illegal financial pursuits of his family clan. The fall of the sweet little rogue regime, to paraphrase Clement Henry, has sparked the hope of seeing a genuine liberalization of political life and the instauration of the first democratic system in the Arab world. Yet, this hopefulness now faces the challenge of creating a framework within which the dialogue between the various components of Tunisian society can take place freely and openly, in such a free and open way as to bring about from inside a genuine process of reform. In this regard, advances in political and economic liberalization and progress on human rights and in the social and educational fields are the only way to ensure the country's stability. The unfolding events in Tunisia have underlined inter alia the following important facts. First, popular grievances at the lack of political governance are common to Tunisia and the rest of the Arab world. Pervasive popular economic misery, compounded with a corrupt autocratic rule relying exclusively on security apparatuses, make the region vulnerable to political turmoil. The grievances that Tunisians expressed during their revolution are indeed widely shared by the overwhelming majority of Arabs. These concern corruption, lack of political and financial accountability, non-legitimate electoral and political systems, absence of peaceful alternation of power, abuse of power, and excessive reliance on security forces. In the case of Tunisia, Ben Ali may have provided the stability wished by his foreign supporters, and especially the United States and France, a high-cost stability that generated suicide either by fire or by fatal attempts to cross the Mediterranean Sea in search of the European El Dorado. Second, the widespread peaceful demonstrations in Tunisia seem to set a new pattern for political change by citizens who dare to challenge an undesirable status quo by braving the bullets of security forces. Third, Arab regimes are dysfunctional, sclerotic, corrupt, and ruthless. Ben Ali or Ali Baba and his 45th depicted Tunisian protesters as terrorists. A few days before his fall, and was totally incapable of any political or social change. The main goal of the Arab Pinochets is to subdue their people through oppression and to serve Western interests. In this context, Tunisia is a main ally in the fight against Islamist networks. It's therefore no surprise that the United States did not react vigorously to the brutality of Ben Ali's police against the demonstrators. Authoritarian regimes have thus benefited from an ambiguous American discourse on democracy. This encourages furthering political suppression and the postponed syndy of genuine reform, particularly in the aftermath of September 11, 2011, which has been used as a pretext for the fight against terrorism. Tunisia perfectly illustrated the situation in which securitization and politicization have weakened the possibility for real democratization. This ultimately compromises the security objectives the United States is seeking to achieve in the region. Democracy promotion is thus rife with its own contradictions, such as the perceived threat of Islamism as a potential to fill the political vacuum. In this sense, democracy and security have become bound together. For security to be achieved, genuine political reform must occur. It's important to point out that the strategic interest of the United States, European Union, and NATO in North Africa, and in the rest of the Arab world, such as fighting terrorism, have generated support for friendly tyrants, rather than for democratization across the region. Instead, a clear US message and democracy promotion should be the foundation of a comprehensive American strategy toward the area. It should feature a multifaceted, realistic, and workable soft security approach that is based on supporting robust representative institutions, nurturing civil society, and integrating Islamist parties and movement into politics. This new approach should look for the root causes of instability rather than fighting the symptoms such as radicalism and anti-Americanism. In this context, the United States should be ready to accept criticism coming from forces that draw their legitimacy from the ballot box. Fourth, political elites in Tunisia and in the Arab world lack a political vision for the future and play more the role of bureaucratic administrators than political player. Rather than promoting genuine democracy, a reinvention of authoritarianism disguised in democratic dressing has emerged, succeeding in manipulating and co-opting civil society. The genuine fracture in the Arab world today is between society and regime, as power is misused and abused without any political perspective or real will to change the situation. The Arab dictators view democratic reform as harmful to their security, while the radicalization of the population is closely related to their increased reliance on authoritarian methods of government, once the vicious circle of radicalization and repression. from the outside, these regimes, those Arab regimes, appear coherent and strong, but in reality, they are made up of multiple factions, including intelligence and security apparatuses, business oligarchies, and robust executive power, which are constantly vying for power and renegotiating the legitimacy of the head of state. Fifth, the general underlying feeling of impotence and discontent can be overcome. Arab societies are indeed now making their desire for emancipation increasingly felt and are demanding a political role tailored to their needs. Sixth, Arab identity and Islamism are by no means incompatible with the notion of modernity, nor with the initiation of serious reforms. Islamism in North Africa is a highly diversified and complex ideology. Islamism in Tunisia does not always mean radicalism, and radicalization is not necessarily identical to terrorism. The Islamist movement is a general concept, including a broad range of Islamic thought, from Erdogan to Taliban, including Sheikh Rashid al-Ghanouchi, Abbasi Madani, Sheikh Abdel Salam Yassin, and others. During the colonial period, this region overdosed on traumatic westernization. And as a result, Islamism manifested itself as a direct reaction to this phenomenon. The democratic roadmap for Tunisia should not exclude the Islamists, who should be considered as one of the major players within Tunisian political landscape. Of course, the religious discourse can be used to justify violence, although it in no way defines the cause. As François Burga has pointed out, the Quran cannot explain Osama bin Laden any more than the Bible can explain the Irish Republican Army. Arab regimes, which made the Islamist political agenda appear more ideological, created a great deal of political violence in order to discredit Islamist movements and used Islamist rhetoric to stigmatize Islamism in general. This is a process that could be labeled the Bin Ladenization or the Talibanization of the Islamists in the Arab world. Seventh, the notion of democracy, human rights, rule of law, independent courts, free media, works' rights, and an educational system adapted to today's economic needs are fundamental and universal values and indispensable for political stability. The pseudo-stability under Ben Ali was a ticking bomb that ended up by exploding. Durable stability in Tunisia, as in Arab country, any Arab country, will come only through genuine democracy that responds fairly to the needs and hopes of the peoples, namely economic and social development, employment, proper public administration, the fight against corruption, the development and consideration of a strong and genuine civil society, the fight for gender equality, conservation of the global cultural heritage, intercultural dialogue, good governance, free and fair media, political participation, and the promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms, freedom of expression and association, the rejection of torture and the abolition of death penalty, and the rejection of intolerance and extremism. Drawing on the lessons of the Tunisian Revolution and looking at the Arab world, a few main policy guidelines may be highlighted. First, in spite of many reverses, the 20th century brought the Arab world a number of benefits which enabled their societies to participate in the world market. This participation does not necessarily mean westernization, but it does mean the acceptance of democratic values as a shared heritage of mankind. That is where cultural dialogue can be useful and fruitful. Second, while it's true that reforms seek to give Arab societies ownership of their destiny, it's through a process of ownership that these reforms should be initiated. The aim here is to engender independent and indigenous dynamic processes in various sectors of society, such as justice, administration, education, in the context of cooperation programs. Third, on both sides, an effort is urgently needed to put an end to the ambiguities which encourage a culture-based process of confrontation, so as to develop normal relations between states and civil societies, while no concessions are possible on the acquis international in its various forms. It would be courageous and salutary for the West to strike a balance between its cultural-based perceptions and political pragmatism. The West's relation with the Arab world will be all the more fruitful, credible, and legitimate if it takes a wide range of interlocutors, giving particular attention and visible political support to actors in civil society, association, and religious life. Similarly, it would help the quality of dialogue if a clear distinction were to be drawn between, on the one hand, respect for human rights and freedom of expression, which are intangible universal principles, and on the other hand, changes in the mechanisms for the devolution of power, which are much more closely linked to history and local traditions. Fourth, oppression and violence generated by authoritarianism have brought Arab society to a dead end. Authoritarianism is dangerous in terms of lives lost and opportunity curbed. If there is to be a meaningful engagement with Arabs, both in situ and in the West, more attention must be given to finding a democratic path that sails safety between the sila of the so-called overseas contingency operations, the new label for the global war on terror, and the charybdis of entrenched authoritarianism and rising radicalism in the region. Finally, fifth, it would thus be advisable that the United States government should rethink its strategic posture toward the Arab world by dissociating itself from policies of repression and social discrimination and economic marginalization. It's important to note that the United States, unlike European countries, is encumbered by colonial baggage. This comparative advantage could be promoted by US policymakers keen to implement genuine and constructive dialogue with different components of Arab civil societies. Ultimately, the objective of the Arab people is to enhance the emergence of vibrant societies engaged in the defense and permanent creation of fundamental liberties and rights that allow societies to regenerate themselves. In this context, the fall of the Brutus of Carthage has deconstructed the Western stereotype, shaping the image of Arab societies as incapable to move towards democracy due to the absence of civic cultures and self-governance. Like Spain's and Portugal's transitions, which began without any prior democratic experience, Tunisia is on its way to democracy building and learning. This might involve some fits and starts, but Tunisians are mature and resolved to assert their freedom. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much, Noureddine and Professor Zartman. You've covered a lot of material, so that makes my job a bit harder. My comments will be a bit scattered, covering not only Tunisia, but actually covering more implications of what's happened in Tunisia over the last 6-7 weeks for the region, as well as what lessons we can draw from this. I will slightly disagree with the idea that what we've seen is not unprecedented, that protests have taken place in the past in Tunisia in 78 and 84, of course in Egypt in 77 and 86, in 2007 and 2008. They were massive labor-based and economic grievance-based protests in Egypt, as there have been in other countries. But I think what's unprecedented, really unprecedented, about what we've seen in Tunisia is that we have not previously seen a mass-based popular protest lead to the ouster of a president or a leader in the Arab world previously. This is remarkable, and it has been mesmerizing, and it is also inspiring, as we see from the tens of thousands of people who protest today all throughout Egypt, in Cairo, Alexandria, Suez, Port Said, and other cities, who were chanting Tunis, Tunis, and who are still occupying Cairo's main square. The vast majority of people in the Arab world are overjoyed. Many have been glued to Al Jazeera, as I have, at least since the beginning of January, if not January 14th and later. And governments in the region are deeply concerned. This is a region that has not been characterized by remarkable stability, quote unquote, but actually the durability or the persistence of these regimes, because these regimes are not stable, they are not based on popular support or representation or the will of the majority, but instead they have been based on authoritarianism, repression, human rights abuses, emergency law as the ordinary and everyday, forged elections, limitations on media freedom and political party activity, and they have, if that was not enough, also been characterized by poor governance. In other words, these regimes have been long-lasting, but they have not been stable. And many of them, if not the majority of them, lack legitimacy. Next door to Tunisia, Mr. Gaddafi has been in power since 1969. That's 42 years. Next door to him, President Mubarak has been in power since October 6, 1981, almost 30 years. In Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh has effectively been in power since 1978, even before the unification of Yemen. And the Al-Assad dynasty in Syria has been in power for 40 years. So this is a region that has been characterized by remarkable regime durability, but not stability, understood in a much more substantive way. Leaders in this region do not leave power as a result of the will of the people or regularly held and peaceful elections, but they either die in office, as was the case for Hafiz al-Assad or others, or they are removed from office by force, as was the case by Habib Bourguiba, by being removed by force by Ben Ali in 87, or removed by force by external actors, as Saddam Hussein was in 2003. With regard to the causes and the dynamics of the Tunisian revolution, I'm not going to recount the case of Mohamed Bouazizi, who has become, and another individual, Hussein Falhi, who also committed suicide on December 22nd by electrocuting himself and shouting before doing so in the midst of a protest, in Sidi Bouzid, shouting no to misery, no to unemployment. But certainly the issue of unemployment or meaningful employment, the harassment, the daily harassment and humiliation suffered at the hands of petty government officials, the lack of recourse to address these concerns, the absence of accountability, and the universal dehumanizing effects of authoritarianism that the vast majority of people living in this region experience are certainly aspects of this in terms of the causes. And the symbolic level, the powerful images of self-immolation, what we've seen elsewhere since December 17th, since January 14th, of cases of self-immolation taking place in Algeria, in Mauritania, in Egypt, and even in Saudi Arabia. Of course, at a structural level, as was mentioned before, unemployment, as well as other features, also contributed to this. A recent World Bank report from 2010 stated the following about Tunisia, quote, "In spite of solid growth, unemployment in Tunisia remains persistent. With growth levels near 5% over the last 8 years, quite high, Tunisia still has a relatively high unemployment rate of 14.7%, which was more than double the 6.4% for all middle-income countries. The overall rate masks a striking divergence by age, with younger groups of the labor force being more affected. Unemployment, and this is not atypical. This is what we see elsewhere in the region. Unemployment also increasingly affects the better educated. The overall unemployment rate of higher education graduates, which was below 5% in 1994, has increased significantly to 23% in 2009. Recent graduates face 46% unemployment 18 months after graduation. So certainly economic issues, unemployment, unequal development regionally in the country, as we saw in Tunisia, but elsewhere, and unequal development in terms of socioeconomic groups, income inequality, and rising income inequality even in the face of supposedly rising GDP per capita rates and economic development. Poverty in places like Egypt have increased, in Yemen and Morocco. Inflation, incredibly high levels of corruption, not only in Tunisia, but in Morocco, in Egypt, in Algeria, and abysmal governance. All of this certainly were some of the structural causes that contributed to what we saw in Tunisia over the last 6 weeks and so on. Economists have talked about the youth bulge, the population structure of many of these countries, in which a very high percentage of the population are below the age of 25, and the pressures that this causes economically to absorb these individuals in meaningful ways, and the political consequences of this difficulty. Certainly all of this contributed to Tunisia's Jasmine Revolution. I think also one can say that, in a sense, regime miscalculation in this immediate period also contributed to the downfall of the Ben Ali regime. It seems that the regime, possibly could have tried to deal with the protests differently over the course of 6 weeks, as opposed to an escalation of the conflict, as opposed to the use of coercion, as opposed to the shooting of nonviolent protesters. So in the span of 10 days, between December 24th and January 4th, 35 people were killed. The weekend of January 7th in Tunisia, the weekend of January 7th to the 10th, at least 14 people were killed. And on January 12th alone, 13 people were killed. With regard to regime miscalculation and the Tunisian military, I think two things have to be stated. The first has already been stated by Professor Zartman, and that is the historic or the differences that one can note with regard to the civil-military relations in Tunisia and the absence of the military historically from politics. President Bourguiba was not a military man, and Tunisia did not receive its independence by the efforts of military officers, as was the case in Libya, Egypt, Algeria to some extent, and Yemen certainly. The institution of the military has played a fundamentally different role in Tunisia's history and politically, and so on. And that's something that's significantly different from many of these other regimes. I think also, and this was mentioned, and I'll just repeat it briefly, the key decision taken by Army Chief of Staff General Rashid Ammar being unwilling to fire on civilian protesters was key. This was crucial, I think, and it has been crucial elsewhere in the regime as it opens the floodgates of protests, allows protests to grow and ignite, and ultimately allows protesters to overwhelm the state, as was the case in Tunisia. Let me move to the regional level, or regional implications for what we've seen in Tunisia. And I think we can talk about this at least three different levels. At the levels of populations, at the people, at the levels of regimes, and economically. As I mentioned at the very beginning, I think it would not be unfair to say that there was tremendous excitement, if not jubilation, a feeling that we are all Tunisians, really, in the Arab world. And people, I think, vicariously experienced the joys of liberation over the last several weeks. We saw immediate declarations by a number of organizations and individuals across the political spectrum in a number of different countries supporting what had happened in Tunisia. Almost immediately, either on January 14th or January 15th, the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood announced its, quote, amazement and appreciation for the historic accomplishments of the Tunisian people. The National Association for Change, led by Mohamed Bouazizi, put out a communique on January the 18th calling for the protests that we witness today all across Egypt. And in that communique, they said, a short communique in the bottom of it, in Tunis, thousands of citizens protested steadfastly, demanding their rights and the rights of future generations. And they achieved their rights with the fleeing of the dictator Ben Ali. And Egypt is not less than Tunis, nor in its men or in its greatness. And we must continue our efforts until the end, until the fleeing of the dictator Mubarak and our rights are restored, unquote. In today's chants in Egypt, we can see this. The chants were التغيير الحرية والعدالة الاجتماعية, change, freedom, and social justice, but also Mubarak, Mubarak, Saudiya fi intizarak. Mubarak, Mubarak, Saudi Arabia is waiting for you, right? Egyptian workers' groups have also been disseminating information about what's been going on in Tunisia with regard to the General Union of Tunisian Workers, with many of their broadcasts led by Tunis is free, Ben Ali is gone, and so on. There have been demonstrations in support of what has happened in Tunisia immediately in front of the Tunisian embassies in Cairo, in Sana'a, in Rabat, and in Amman. And of course, there have been copycat self-immolations that I'm sure you have heard about, and that number has been increasing, something we haven't seen before in the Arab world, and something that is unlike Southeast Asia and unlike the tradition of Buddhism, and something that is in some ways anathema to Islam. And we've seen actually discussions about this, including by Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who spoke in a very sympathetic way about the plight of Mohamed Bouazizi, and so on. Regimes, as I said, in the region have also been taking caution and have been very concerned. Interestingly enough, Qatar was the first state to respond or to make a statement, followed by Egypt, followed by Saudi Arabia. And interestingly enough, although not surprisingly, European reaction, another reaction to the events in Tunisia, quite late of course, and I'll talk about that in a moment, have called upon the necessity of democracy and free and fair elections. Of course, we've seen nothing like that language in the official reactions of the Arab states. We've seen calls for respecting the will of the Tunisian people. We've seen calls for the importance of stability. We've seen talk about the brotherly relations of Tunis and the Arab people, but we've seen no statements about the necessity of democracy or free and fair elections. And of course, the outlier even in this group was Mr. Muammar al-Gaddafi, who denounced the events in Tunisia and said that the Tunisians made a mistake and that they spilled blood for nothing and that they should have waited until 2014 when Mr. Ben Ali said he was not going to run again for president. We've seen regimes also, and this is quite interesting, and even before Ben Ali fled the country on January the 14th, we've seen regimes react in Mauritania, in Algeria, and in Jordan in the week before his departure by increasing subsidies on basic foodstuffs. And we've seen this also most recently, in the last few days, in Egypt, increasing subsidies on basic foodstuffs, as well as the announcement of the creation of 20,000 new jobs in different ministries, and so on, as an attempt to preempt protests based on economic grievances, of course flying in the face of what the IMF delegation team that was just in Cairo and just came back was preaching. And we've seen, of course, increased statements in the press about concerns for unemployment and job creation and so on. And we've also seen markets that have been jittery as a result of what's happened in Tunisia. The Egyptian pound over the last week has fallen to its low of 5 or 6 years against the US dollar. The Cairo stock market fell 9% in the week after bin Ali left. So what are some of the lessons or some of the implications that we can draw from this? Some of them have been mentioned, and I'll try to be very brief. First, I think, and quite astounding from the perspective of political science, that how this regime fell, how the bin Ali regime fell. What we study as political scientists often, but not always the case, are political parties, elections, institutions, social movements, civil society groups. But there seemed to be no organized opposition. There seemed to be no charismatic leader, no organized social movement, as it were, that led to the toppling of this regime. Secondly, the speed at which the regime fell is also quite startling. A regime that had been in place for 23 years fell in less than 30 days. Another, I think, very interesting point, and I think we'll be seeing more about this in the coming weeks and years, concerns what we can call neoliberal economic reform. Many of these countries, Tunisia, Jacques Chirac referred to as an economic miracle. The IMF and the World Bank praised Tunisia as a model of reform early on in the Arab world, have experienced, as I mentioned before, relatively high rates of growth, high foreign direct investment, rising GDP per capita. Egypt is also an example of this. And this masks the underbelly of the economic reality. There's a kind of superficiality to much of this economic growth that certainly doesn't reach all segments of society, all areas in the country. And I would not be surprised, as we've seen, according to Al Jazeera, the Egyptian government announced that subsidy increases were going to amount to, in the next year, between 700 million to $1 billion US. I would not be surprised in the coming period if we saw a retreat from the enthusiasm of privatization and economic reform and liberalized economies, as it were, for political reasons, certainly. Another lesson, and this has been referred to also, has been the Islamists, right? Where are the Islamists in all of this? I think the basic recognition that the Islamists obviously weren't behind what was going on in Tunisia is a correct observation, but at the same time I think it would be false to think somehow that in the future of Tunisia, Islamist parties and Islamist movements were not going to play some role. I think that would be false. They certainly will play a role. Tunisia is not removed, although slightly different, not removed from the region, and we've seen the rise of Islamist politics elsewhere, and I think that Islamists are going to play a role in Tunisia's future in some way or another, as it were. The other point, I think, is, two last points, very briefly, is not only do protesters and populations learn sometimes false lessons, like the idea of self-immolation leading to the downfall of a regime, but regimes also learn. And what we've seen, of course, today, in fact, is the Egyptian Interior Ministry releasing a communique stating that they did not detain any young girls as a result of the protests, trying to be careful, extra careful in terms of their use of force, how they're represented in the media, and so on, not to have things get out of control. The last thing, at a theoretical level, it is wonderful to celebrate bin Ali's departure and hopefully the renaissance of democracy in the Arab world. But I think it's important not to forget that this was not inevitable. In other words, it's easy now with bin Ali no longer on the scene, and what was not so long ago thought seemingly impossible made into reality, to forget that this was not inevitable, that things did not have to turn out exactly this way. And I think this is a lesson especially for political scientists who might no longer study authoritarianism in the coming period, but study transitions to democracy. That's not necessarily the case. And then the last point to make is simply, and also not surprisingly, that the United States, as expected, got this incredibly wrong. Right? The United States was a supporter of the bin Ali regime from the very beginning. And not only has it been a supporter of the bin Ali regime from the very beginning, I don't know how to get this to be slide. Oh, here it is. Not only was it a supporter of the regime from the very beginning, but even in the last days of the Ben Ali regime, the comments of the State Department and of the Secretary were really completely out of touch with what was going on in the world. So, of course, some of you can probably see this, right? President Ben Ali is invited to the White House by President Reagan, but a date can't be established. He comes to Washington, meets the first President Bush in '89. There's an official state visit in 1990. First Lady Hillary Clinton and her daughter Chelsea Clinton visit Layla Ben Ali in Tunis in March 1999, and so on. We can actually, this is the 1999 visit with, so she knows the Ben Alis very well, right? This is at the airport. This is seeing a good works project that Layla Trabulsi was up to at that period. This is President Clinton at the United Nations with Mr. Ben Ali. This is Colin Powell here at the Willard Hotel. And to be accurate, only during the Bush administration did concerns of political reform begin to make the agenda. And they were stated. Of course, that didn't stop the administration from extending security assistance and military assistance, not at the levels that we see in Egypt. But nevertheless, there were, for the first time after 2003, the broaching of the subject of political reform. This is Mr. Ben Ali at the White House in 2004. Of course, as I said, Tunisia was the darling of the international financial institutions. This is Secretary Rice in Tunis in 2008. This is, of course, Secretary Clinton with the Tunisian foreign minister quite recently here in Washington, D.C. We don't need to see any of those. And what I said by the recent history, over the last couple of weeks, the terrible mistakes I think that were made, is demonstrated in a January 11th interview that Hillary Clinton gave with Al Arabiya TV when she was in the Gulf. The very first question that the interviewer asks her is, starting with the latest in Tunisia, what are you exactly worried about? Well, we are worried in general about the unrest and the instability, blah, blah, blah. So we are not taking sides in it. We just hope that there can be a peaceful resolution of it. About 35 or 40 people had been killed already at this stage, peaceful protesters. The reporter is a bit surprised at this response. But Tunisia had summoned yesterday the American ambassador because there was a statement that the State Department made. How do you respond to that? Blah, 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 blah. And as I say, we are not taking sides in this, right? On January 18th, President Obama called President Mubarak in Egypt, reassuring him that the U.S. wants calm and an end to the violence. And Mr. Feltman, the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, who was quite recently in Tunisia under the previous regime, was dispatched to, he was most recently in Tunisia in 2010, March, was dispatched to Tunis yesterday. Okay, thank you very much.